Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping podcast. My name is Daniel and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. Today on the podcast we're starting with a very large number. We're starting with 100 billion. Now, let's say I gave you a spreadsheet with 100 billion rows in it. Each row consisted of 5 columns: latitude, longitude, device ID, a timestamp, and a column telling you the name of the data provider. What would you do with that? How would you clean it? How would you make sense of it, extract value from it? What do you think people would use it for? And how would you do all of this stuff in a way that could be systematized, in a way that you could repeat again tomorrow? So Foursquare does this every day with the help of something they call a movement engine. To help us understand more about how they do this, I've invited Gabriel Durkin, the Director of Data Science, on the podcast. So this is the last in a series of episodes that I have been working on together with Foursquare, and I have to say they have been absolutely brilliant to work with. If you're interested in hearing some of the previous episodes, I'll put links to them in the show notes of today's episode. But for right now, we're back to the 100 billion points. Hey Gabriel, welcome to the podcast. You are the Director of Data Science at Foursquare. You have something called a movement engine over there, and you process 100 billion records, GPS records, I should say, each and every day. At least that's what I got out of our pre-interview conversation. I'm hoping you can put a few more words around that in just a minute. But my guess is you haven't always been the Director of Data Science at Foursquare. How did you get there? Where did you come from? How did you get involved in processing movement data?
Well, it's nice to be here, first of all, Daniel. When it comes to how I got here, it's been a sort of a circuitous journey. For the first 20 years of my adult working life, I was a quantum physicist. I did my PhD at Oxford in quantum physics and then moved to the States to work at the Jet Propulsion Lab and then at the NASA Ames Research Center. We had a quantum computing team there and I was part of it. So, data science was kind of a career change for me, probably 7 years ago now. And, I worked at Uber and some other startups doing, first as an independent contributor and then eventually moving into management. And that's some of the story about how I got here today, working at Foursquare on geospatial data, leading the movement engine, which is a name for the team, the people working on movement data, but also a name for the platform that we built.
That is a cool name for a team, the movement engine. Hey, if we just stay with your past just for a second here, what was it like going from quantum physics, I think you said, over to geospatial data? Was it a big jump? Like, was there anything that was difficult to learn? Was there a huge vocabulary shift, or is it all just, more data?
Yeah, I mean, it was a choice I made just because I wanted to work, more broadly in industry. I enjoy research. I still consider myself a quantum physicist, but I wanted to, work in a faster paced environment. And I'd been at NASA a long time, so I thought a change of pace might be interesting. And I knew that data science was a career that had a lot of transferable skills for people with, PhDs in the so-called hard sciences, numeracy, analytical skills. Also, kind of, I think the best data scientists are the ones that have that kind of scientific curiosity, willing to kind of turn over every rock. That's something that it's hard to just, learn at college. I think it's kind of either you have that instinct or you don't. So, yeah, so I cut my teeth on geospatial data at Uber and learned a lot there. It's a completely different type of work. I mean, there's certainly the science aspect of it, but it's also working collaboratively with people with different backgrounds, designers and product managers. So it's actually quite an enriching experience, and I've definitely enjoyed it. And it was for me, it was the right career move. And it's only something that's become possible. I mean, data science as a career has only really existed for just over 10 years, I guess. And so the career path to data science these days is quite varied. But there was a program and it's called the Inside Data Science. It's kind of a fellowship where they, in a very short space of time, kind of prep you for the world of work as a data scientist. And for me, that program was invaluable. I think there's no way I would have passed any of the data science interviews, which are really quite rigorous for tech companies, without that experience. So I owe a lot of it to Inside Data Science.
That is really interesting. I naively just assume that someone with your background, oh, great, I'm really good at maths. I understand all these complicated processes. I've worked with big chunks of data before.
Yeah.
just change my name or change the title, sorry, and voila, now I'm a data scientist. That's interesting to hear you say that there was a prep course involved and that you're
Yeah.
great and that you got a lot out of it as well, which is possibly even more interesting.
I would say yes. I mean, there's part of the narrative is like, especially people do well if they have a background, like let's say in astronomy, where they're good at dealing with large data sets. But it's really quite different. There's always the fear that someone with a nerd with a PhD is going to be good at burrowing into problems, but isn't actually very focused on execution or whether you have a sense of urgency, or whether your technical expertise is aligned with the business objectives of the company. So those are all things that you have to demonstrate to, allay those fears that you're just some very technical nerd who, has minimal impact for the business. And that's always something that we struggle with, I think, as data scientists. So yeah, it's very important to kind of exercise those muscles, like the business acumen part of things. Also, just being able to talk to non-technical stakeholders about your work and why it has impact. Communication is key.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that with us. I really appreciate it. The promise of this podcast is like the focus on this movement engine and these 100 billion records that you process each day. And I think we should maybe shift the conversation towards that.
Mhm.
So let's start with these records. What is all that data and where is it coming from?
100 billion records. Think of a GPS record as it's a row in a data table, that is, you might call it a ping, right? It's a latitude, a longitude, and a timestamp, and a device ID associated with it. So we at Foursquare, have a differentiating component compared with maybe other big data companies, in that we have our own owned and operated apps. And those owned and operated apps, one of the famous ones is Swarm, which is our life logging app, or Foursquare City Guides. Those apps, generate data for us as well, right? So the user of Swarm likes to be able to remember, whether how many times this week they went to the gym, or what their sequence of movements was yesterday. But we also can leverage that data to improve our own data collection, our own algorithms that we build on top of the data. That's one component of the data. So we have those pings, those latitude, longitudes, and timestamps from our own apps. We also collect the majority of the data from like third-party sources. Those sources could be, apps themselves, or they might be, from other data companies, and that contributes to the 100 billion records that we ingest every day.
Oof, yeah, that's a lot of data. So I guess that one of the big questions now is, well, what do you do with that? Is it all just ready to use, like analysis ready data, or do you have to do something to it first?
No, definitely not. There's gold in them hills, but it's not all golden, I would say. And the data is very raw. Like, it is just literally those raw records. And one of the things that my team is responsible for is refining that raw data. Just like an oil refinery might be responsible for turning oil into different things like petroleum-based products like car gasoline or butane or whatever through fractional distillation. We're trying to distill value out of the raw data itself. And this raw data, it comes from multiple providers, multiple sources. Some of it's internal to Foursquare, some of it is these third-party sources. And really, what we're doing with it is trying to imbue it with geospatial intelligence, right? Trying to extract value out of it. So, you take the raw pings and the first kind of part of the process. What we're doing with it is really like building up more complex structures out of the just flat data that we're collecting. So you start with the completely unstructured raw data, and from that you build those pings up into, well, first of all, you might try to classify if the pings are associated with a mobile phone or a device that is in motion or at rest. So you do classification on those pings at the device level, at the ping level. Then you might start structuring those pings into what we call segments. So it's this process of segmentation. So collections of pings might be seen as participating in a moving segment for that device. Like if the person who owned the device is walking down the street, or if they're traveling in a vehicle along the road. If the person has stopped, there may be a collection of those pings that is associated with the stop, right? Maybe there's a clustering around a particular commercial venue. That's definitely of interest, right? So you go from pings to this segmentation to produce these segments, which may be stops or moving segments. And there is maybe like a majority vote, right? Like if you can put a lasso around a set of these pings, maybe the majority of them are stop pings, but there's a few moving pings in there. You do a harmonization to say, well, within this cluster, most of these pings are stop pings. So we'd identify the whole cluster as a stop cluster. Then you might build up, now you have these segments, you can build up this timeline, sort of more of a holistic understanding of the user's journey. But we might just be looking at one particular provider, right? We might be looking at one source of the data. It might be coming from our own app, or it might be coming from one of the external providers. So we build up a timeline from those segments for the device. And we do that per source. We've gone through this process of building up structure, right? We've gone from pings to segments, and then from segments to timelines. And when you have a timeline per source, then the next process is, an additional one of harmonization, kind of data fusion, right? We want to build a master timeline for that device where we reconcile the different storylines that are being told for the user of that device, for a particular day. So, one provider might be saying, well, the person was in motion and then they stopped somewhere for 30 minutes before picking up again and going somewhere else. That may not be completely aligned between the different providers from which we get the data. So we can do again like a sort of a weighted majority vote. For each moment in time, we can decide how many of the providers are telling a movement story versus others that say, no, actually, that device was at rest. And we can even be more sophisticated than that, and it can be weighted by the value that we attach to each provider. Like some providers, the data is more likely to be higher quality, let's say, than others. Sometimes the data can be synthetic that they provide. Sometimes it's very noisy. Sometimes it's been manipulated in some way. Like for instance, the data can be snapped to a grid. When you have a particular ping at a location, sometimes the latitude and longitude get rounded up, and it basically causing the location of the ping to be snapped to somewhere on the grid. So there's all sorts of components to the quality of the input data, and then that gives us the ability to define kind of a quality score for the providers, and that can then go into the weighting of how much we value their perspective on what the device was doing when we build these storylines for for that user journey.
Wow, I've got a bunch of questions, and I hope that you'll bear with me for a minute here. The first one being, if I only see a device once across all the data sets, does it get a higher weighting, or do you treat that differently? My guess is it's always nice to see a device multiple times. Like, yeah, it definitely is a device. Many, like multiple providers see that data, that device in their data set.
Yes, that's right. That can contribute to the kind of our ability to determine the veracity of the device. Like, is this a real device? That's one component of it. Another component of it is, of course, the ping could be real, and it might end up in our data set. We do try to aggressively filter on quality and veracity. We try to filter out some of that synthetic data for sure. But if a device is only seen once in a blue moon, it makes it much harder to reconstruct this sort of holistic understanding of their user journey throughout the day. And for some applications, that doesn't matter as much. But in general, we want to start by having the fullest understanding of what a device was doing throughout the day. So if we only have very patchy appearances of the device in the data, it becomes very hard to kind of impute, what's happening in the gaps where we don't see the device, and we feel more confident about building high quality data products when we can actually have the most holistic understanding of the device's movements. So yes, that data will not be excluded, but maybe it'll be considered to be low fidelity, or will only be used for certain products and not others.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you ever interpolate the gaps that you see in the data? Let's say you have this, I think you talked about journeys. So you could say that you're segmenting these pings into at rest, movement, and for a single device, if the gap isn't too big, do you ever interpolate that gap, interpolate the no data points?
Yeah. No, it's good. It's a really good question. And on very small timescales, yes, we do. Like I mean, one of the ways we form, like, say, a stop segment is if we establish that a cluster of pings is contributing to what we call a stop. When we create the timeline for that stop, we create a dwell time for the stop, and it's really just the kind of the maximum timestamp that's in that cluster, subtracting off the minimum timestamp. So we're establishing that even though we only have a few pings contributing to it, we kind of fill in that segment in the timeline and say, like, during this block of time, the person was stopped. Maybe they were at a venue. The more difficult thing is kind of like between segments, when there are gaps between segments, because obviously, in an ideal world, you would want to have a stop segment followed by a movement segment followed by a stop segment, and so when these things are being created, there is a kind of a process of coalescing. I mean, if you have two moving segments that are close together, we will coalesce them into one larger moving segment because it just makes sense. There should be this kind of flip-flopping between moving and stopped, right? But there are times where, for an extended period of hours, for whatever reason, perhaps the person with the device was indoors, or their battery died, or, they got on a plane. Like, there's lots of reasons why they disappear from our radar. And we don't try to do currently, with the way we process the data, we don't try to get too inventive with how we interpolate between those in those large gaps. And the one exception to that is, in the evening and at night. Like, if you live in, let's say you live in a concrete apartment building, the chances of signal being able to reach a satellite in order to produce and record these pings is, very attenuated. So if we see that you stopped or that you entered a building that has been designated as your home in our modeling, and we don't see any pings for many hours, and it's during the nighttime. If you then reappear the next morning within a proximity of a few hundred meters or so of where you disappeared off our radar, and it was overnight, then we will interpolate between those two points at which we did have data and say, like, you had an overnight stop at this place. And it's even more likely to be the case if it's a place that our modeling has designated that you live. We'll call that an overnight stop, even though we didn't have any data in that gap. But other than that, there are companies out there that are in the business of generating synthetic data to kind of mimic, human patterns of movement. But we don't currently do that at Foursquare. So we try to minimally interpolate when there are gaps. We let those gaps exist for the most part.
And are all these data streams, are they being delivered to you in real time? And what I'm wondering here is that let's say you get a delivery of data, or your own systems, your own apps pick up this device ID. You can see it today, and then a week later you get some more data from a third party provider. Do you need to wait a certain amount of time to gather that data in and make sure that you can like identify those devices before you start processing data? Does that make sense?
I mean, this is a really good question. You kind of hit the nail on the head with one of the issues in consuming third-party data. There are always issues. There are issues around quality, but there are also issues around latency. Obviously, the data that we get from our own apps, we're able to process fairly quickly. There's very low latency there, and it's high quality because we own the data. That never leaves the boundaries of our company's data. So the external data, it's interesting. If you consider a particular date of observation, a date during which stuff was happening in the real world, and we want to collect as much of that third party data as possible, it can take many days. Now we get deliveries daily from third parties, but it can take many days to fill in all the blanks about that day of observations, the date in which the pings were generated. Like, even 5, 6 days later, it's worth waiting those extra few days to get more, to fill in the blanks and to get substantially more data about that particular day of observation. So the flip side of that is then, if this data is going to be used for anything that requires a quick turnaround, like, for instance, some of our data products lead to attribution, right? If someone sees an ad for a quick serve restaurant, on their mobile device, that ad impression may be registered with that device. And then, much like digital, a little bit more challenging, I would say, than digital conversions, where someone might see an ad for socks and then click on a website and go and buy some socks, like, within 10 minutes of seeing the ad. It's a more of a challenge to connect the real world conversion of someone walking into a quick serve restaurant because they saw an ad for a hamburger on online and it made them hungry. But either way, there's still this issue of the conversion window, and we want to have like feedback from the campaign, from the advertising campaign that produced the impression, like as soon as possible. And depending on the needs of the client, that may be, ideally within a few days. So we wait more time to collect more data so we can say, so we can make more high fidelity, observations about what the person did in the real world. But then the clients also want a fast turnaround. So that, typically there's some sort of sweet spot. It could be, between 2 or 3 and 7 days, depending on the client and their tolerance for a delay in waiting for that signal.
This is a perfect segue onto like the next obvious question here, which is what is this data used for? And in a previous conversation, you've mentioned this idea of attribution and targeting, and I want to get into that in just a second. But at first, I want to understand about movement and at rest,
Mm.
because I think this will help people understand the like where the conversation is going to go from here. Which one of those two things is more important for you as a company? To know that the device is moving or at the device is at rest?
Yes. So actually, there's a good story behind this. So when I came to the company, one of the things I was tasked with was, building a team to upgrade these, movement pipelines, use, more cutting edge technology and more robust, make these pipelines more robust. And, we were looking at how things have been done previously, and there's a certain amount of ML and algorithmic work that went into it. And we wanted to move quickly and build something that was simple to understand and also easy to maintain. So we started by building a baseline model for this movement segmentation piece that's not relying on kind of off the shelf algorithms or any sophisticated ML that would then require upkeep and ML ops practices. I think just in general as a data scientist, we should always start by building a simple heuristic rule-based model, and that can be our baseline, but it also demonstrates that the people who are tackling the problem understand the problem because they built rules that work. And it's also super easy to debug, whereas ML can be a bit of a black box phenomenon. So what one of the epiphanies we had was, as you look at a device trail as someone is walking down the street with their mobile phone in their pocket, it's easier to actually measure movement, right? And you sort of see this with even when you're using like Google Maps, like quite often it doesn't know which way you're facing when you start driving. Like it thinks you're going the wrong way down the street and then it quickly updates and flips you around on the map. And so my point is that actually movement is easier to detect than stops. And in some sense, stops are like the absence of movement. So actually indexing on movement was one of the key things that we were able to do to actually get much more accurate like understanding of this phenomenon. It sounds trivial, like I know very clearly if I'm moving or at rest, but the mobile phone signals can suffer from all sorts of jitter and issues with urban canyons, signals reflecting off buildings or walls. It's called multipath, I guess. In indoor underground use, satellites being blocked, and so on, trees. And it's actually non-trivial to try and solve that. And so you could look at speed, for instance, but because of the jitter that's in the signal, the kind of speed measurements are quite often not reliable when you're trying to do this segmentation. So the takeaway was that we wanted to focus on movement instead of worrying about stops. Let's focus on movement because when you're moving down the street, your trajectory takes a very definite shape. So the idea was to focus on the shape of the trajectory rather than like things like speed. Because like an old lady shuffling down the street with her shopping bags is not moving very quickly, and her signal may have a lot of jitter in it. But if you look at her kind of average trajectory, it's a very uncoiled shape. And so that's kind of the metric that we were using. It's the kind of a shape metric. I call it the spaghetti shape index. Versus like when you're stopped, your ping trail tends to be kind of coiled up. Maybe because of jitter, it looks like you're moving fast, but your trail tends to be kind of coiled up like spaghetti on a fork. So then stops became like the absence of movement once we had that epiphany. And what's interesting is yes, we focused on movement, but actually in terms of our business, stops provide more value, but it's kind of like yin and yang. So stops provide value because if you can define a device is at rest, if it's in the vicinity of some commercial venue, then you can say maybe that person who was stopped there went into that coffee shop nearby. So you've elevated this stop from being a stop becoming a visit by doing this venue attachment. Once you have a visit, then there's all sorts of like commercial applications that open up. And you mentioned already there's attribution and targeting. If someone goes into coffee shops regularly, we can assign them to an audience, a bucket of devices that can be sold as the audience can be sold as an audience of coffee lovers, right? And so the attribution and targeting are like the opposite sides of the coin with digital advertising, right? First of all, need to understand, what type of person might be interested in an advertisement, right? Digital advertisement. And so you show someone a coffee ad and they're susceptible to drinking coffee, then that's a good approach, right? The other side of it is attribution, right? When you show them the ad, do we know if that person responded and went to a coffee shop? And we have a team at the company that looks at making that connection and doing it in a sophisticated enough way to understand, like, would that person have gone to the coffee shop anyway, even if we had not shown them the ad? So there's ML in this in terms of like causal inference models to compare the actual behavior with the counterfactual, like the baseline, which is people tend to go to coffee shops anyway. Is there a lift in their visitation if they see an ad, right? So that's a very valuable revenue generating activity for the company, like being able to connect stops to venues to be able to assign visits, and then from the visit you can match that back to an ad impression, and then that's what attribution is. So like our partners, the clients that are interested in our attribution product can understand if their advertising campaigns are successful or not.
When you talk about it like that, it sounds like you're looking at stops and movement in, as discrete objects. Okay, that this one stop was important to us, but again, like harking back to our previous conversation, you had this great phrase. Let me see if I can pronounce it correctly. It was a semantically meaningful journey, and when you said that, it made me think like maybe this is more than just one discrete stop. Maybe this is trying to build up a picture of the journey itself. Like, what was this device doing during the day? What does the pattern of the weekly, daily, monthly pattern of this device look like? Am I on the right track or am I completely out of scope?
No, no, I think you're right. Yes, there is definitely a contrast between the kind of once and done scenarios that I'm describing. Like, it's much more generic to say someone tends to visit coffee shops, or to say, oh, they saw this ad and then they went to the coffee shop, right, or the quick serve restaurant. It is definitely like, I think, foundational to, as a data scientist, I want to be able to recreate a picture of reality. Like, I want to be faithful to what's happening in the real world for the users of these devices. And, that's kind of foundational to what we try to do. And it's not anything necessarily that I want to make a distinction between that and then what is actually presented as a product, either internally or to external clients. There's lots of privacy concerns that we have front and center about, the products that we deliver. But as a data scientist, it's my goal to have a full understanding, because I don't want to make mistakes about how I infer what was happening with that person. If we have that full picture, we can serve those obvious use cases of targeting and attribution. But there are other, more sophisticated scenarios that you're alluding to with, like, wouldn't it be great if we could understand the full, like, longitudinal movements of a device throughout the day? And it also helps us understand the quality of our data. If for a particular provider we can't do that reconstruction in a very convincing way, it might suggest that that provider is not giving you very high quality data. But in terms of like how we derive on, that full longitudinal understanding, that holistic understanding of the user journey throughout the day, one of the applications for this is that we have a client who is interested in building synthetic models, synthetic twins of real users in the real world. These digital synthetic twins, they populate cities with these synthetic models, and from these models that are trained on the real data that we supply them. So this is a scenario where we do have to have high quality longitudinal stories about these, these holistic stories about the user journey, because then the models they build will be of much higher quality. And these are the types of synthetic models that are really really useful to like city transit authorities, urban planners, as they kind of model the flow of human beings through the urban landscape. It can really help with things like urban planning. The good thing about that is it's very privacy safe, because none of the real user data gets exposed, to the outside world. It's merely used to train these synthetic models.
That sounds fascinating. You're talking about the like getting data in different chunks, like earlier on in the conversation, and you were relating this to attribution. How is our client going to know if the device saw the walk past the billboard and then when had a cup of coffee? But that made me think of this idea. Wow, you could monitor like a disaster, for example, or you could look at a disaster in retrospect and see how people responded to it, like leading up to it and afterward, maybe even during it and after it. Do you know of anyone doing work like that?
I mean, I can say the answer is yes. We have a government client that's very interested in modeling what happens in, not even modeling, but just actually observing what happens in the aftermath of, let's say, a hurricane. You can imagine that satellite data can be rather patchy. You may not have satellite imagery of what's happening. So, in terms of like even disaster relief and planning for future disasters and response to those, this sort of data is and will be immensely valuable. So we do have an interest from a client in that, and I probably can't say who it is, but that is definitely, you've hit the nail on the head there too with that.
It's so interesting. You talked about satellite data. For the last little while, people were talking about we can use satellite data and we can look at the car park at Walmart and figure out how many cars in there and sort of, long story short, figure out what the share price is going to be, essentially, whether it's going to go up and down. Lots of people visiting Walmart. But my guess is you have pretty great data on that. Do you work with satellite companies to help them sort of augment the analysis that they're producing? Or could you?
There are companies that, like you mentioned, will take that satellite data and try to infer, as you say, if for a particular big box store there are 20% fewer cars in the parking lots this quarter compared to last quarter, maybe earnings will be down, right? That has all sorts of, potential issues in that the data is really quite sparse. There until recently, I think, Planet Labs has these amazing doves that encircle the globe and maybe have a daily line scan image of the Earth that gets updated daily. But apart from them, I mean, you're relying on very low coverage of parking lots of big box stores, from other satellites, and you're also at the mercy of the weather, and you're also at the mercy of the fact that parking lots can be underground, right? So definitely the people that are interested in our data products might be using those as well for the same purposes. But I would say that we're immune to some of those concerns, like weather, for instance, right? We can actually determine what foot traffic was like to a particular high street store or big box store in a way that is much less sparse. So that's definitely one of the applications of the, us being able to generate visits from stops. That's like a direct application of visits. These are kind of like business insights that you would derive from the visits.
It's interesting. Like this really makes me think that that whole argument, and I realize it was just an example that they could, yeah, a tangible example that they could tell people about. Oh, we could do this, and my guess is this was an example that was sort of supposed to help people to open people's eyes to the possibilities. But it really does make me think like there's probably a better way of doing this, and maybe your data is a better way of doing this.
Just going back to the this conversation about how we use the data to like provide insights about foot traffic to various chains and sort of business categories. There is that data, of course, coming in from third parties, but one of the things we really focus on is coming back to this idea that we have our own owned and operated apps. We can look at, and this comes down to quality, right? And this is one of the ways in which we filter aggressively for quality. Like I just wanted to bring this up, like looking at the intersection of those devices that are in both the data from our own apps and that appear in the third party apps, we're able to, well, first of all, we build a machine learning model to determine like which providers are more trustworthy than others. In other words, think of it this way: if our first party apps are saying that at a particular point in time, a device that is in third party and in first party data, if that device at that time was, let's say, in San Francisco, where I am, and a third party app says, oh, well, actually, that device is 20 miles away or it's in San Jose, right? That's an example of a training label we can then apply to the third party data. We can look at the composition of the stops and visits that we generate, and they're composite. Some of the pings come from one provider, some of them come from another source. And so we can see, like, based on the composition, what's the likelihood that stop is real or that visit is real. And then we can build a model on top of that. So we can train on the devices that are in the intersection of our data and the third party data. And then we can apply the model to predict on top of the third party data. And that way, we can do some very aggressive filtering for this idea of veracity. And that way, because as you say, there's 100 billion pings coming in, we need to be very careful about how much of that we just directly ingest in a very naive fashion. So at the very top of the funnel, we can actually take that data and apply these models and start to really restrict it, like turn down the flow based on these like veracity predictions. And that way, then we get to something we can say more confidently about how many people visited the mall that day or the big box store.
Would it be fair to say that you can use your own first party data as a form of ground truth?
Yeah, of course, that's right. Yeah. I see it as sort of a quality assurance chain that starts with, we have this app that has such a great loyal user base, the Swarm app. And these people are creating their own visits. Basically, they're doing it for themselves, but in a way, they're doing it for us too, right? We know then that, when the phone says this person stopped somewhere, that the algorithm inside the phone that is part of our app is doing a good job because the person is verifying. The human in the loop is creating that training label and saying, yes, I was at this venue. So we can calibrate our own models on our first party apps. And then the chain then goes to the third party data. So we use the first party data to validate the third party data and do this veracity modeling. That's the way I look at it, as a chain of, quality assurance.
I'm really, really pleased you shared that with me. It makes a lot of sense and it's interesting. So we've been talking about these different sort of use case applications for the data. You've done a great job of telling us about the data, where it comes from, how you process it, the way you check it, these checks and balances that are in place, the idea of segmenting it into stops and movement and why that's important. We talked a little bit about attribution and targeting, the flow during the city through a city, this idea of a segmentically meaningful journey. I want you to describe one last example for us, if you would please, and this is the idea of crowdsourced routing.
Right. Yeah. So this is work in progress. Part of our research team is working on, if you think about it, and this is a good example. Like earlier, we were talking about how most of the value we bring through understanding the raw GPS data is in determining stops and then visits. And then obviously that leads to attribution. But now that we are doing a better job at segmenting, the movement in terms of understanding movement itself, not just the stops. You can imagine a very straightforward application is, when you look at a map, you might look at a hotspots, hotspots on the map. You can aggregate where people stop, on some grid, at the Foursquare, we use the H3 grid system, hexagonal grid system. So you can just simply do a binning, like how many stops have occurred in this particular location. And that'll tell you maybe some information about like where people enter a building, right? Because people stop near the entrance, or the density of stops is higher near the entrance of a building. So it gives you some meaningful understanding of places beyond just say polygons. So that's about stops, right? So what to think about movement? So instead of thinking about hot spots, you could think about hot trails, right? Like we also like aggregate people's movement segments, like again on a H3 grid. It's a way to kind of coarse grain those trails, those moving segments. It also guarantees a certain amount of privacy because we're talking about public roads, and we want to sort of snap people's moving segments to those roads, and the ones that are more heavily trafficked are the ones that then you might designate as these hot trails. In some sense, that's crowdsourced routing, right? Like you learn in computer science about pathfinding algorithms like the Dextra pathfinding, right, which tries to find the shortest, lowest cost path between two spots. But there may be other reasons why on a map that people use a different sequence of waypoints, a different route through the map than maybe the shortest one. And so, much as when I don't know if you were a kid growing up, like I grew up in Ireland, and in the country there are always these kind of well-worn paths, and you wonder like were they made by people or by animals, like through the the forests and the hills. This is an example like that, right? Where you're finding that kind of hot trail on the map, and that could definitely have an application for sure. So we're just exploring that and seeing if we can actually produce that as a product, and working with sales folks to see if there is a market for it.
That would be really interesting to see how that plays out. You know what it reminds me of? You go to the restaurant and it says popular. Most people eat this thing here, and it gives you a sense of certainty. And I just imagine looking at my, navigation app thing there, fastest, shortest, most eco-friendly, and popular. And I wonder which one people would choose because popular, there's a certain amount of certainty that comes with that. Most people choose this one.
That's right. That's right. And quite often routing apps will send you on a route that maybe doesn't penalize left turns. Like maybe it's the shortest, like end to end, but there are more. Maybe it's a more dangerous, less effortless way to go. So I think sometimes, as you're implying, like maybe the kind of the lowest common denominator route is the one that is the most effortless, and maybe that's kind of what we should be optimizing for.
Yeah, or maybe it's the most peaceful, maybe it's the most beautiful, maybe it's
Yeah,
the whatever else,
that's
like
right, that's right.
most scenic. And my guess is there'd be an interesting overlap, between what the computer thinks is the best and what the humans think is the best. I mean, so in the city where I live, for example, there's lots of cycleways everywhere, and they've made a huge effort to try and please go on the cycleway, but people always cut corners if they can because well, that's great. The machine said I should go straight here, but you know what? The human in me just wants to turn around the corner there. And you can see these well-worn bike paths, just on the side and these little sneaky routes that people take because that is clearly a great place for humans to go. Humans would like to move in that direction or in that way. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, it'd be great if that we could have like a data informed approach to that too, right? I think that would be amazing.
Yeah, yeah, and that like this ties back into what you were saying earlier about city planning. If we know more, the more we know about the movement, how are the people living in the city actually moving through the city? And if we can model that and create a city, and how would they like to move through here? Not how are we going to force them to move. There's probably a bit of give and take there, but I think that would be interesting.
Yes, for sure. And also, like, I think there is a component of this that is going back to semantic segmentation. I mean, I think, and, much as like, when we do, let's say, video calls, and the algorithm on your video call knows the difference between you and the foreground, and then it can blur out the background. So it has that distinction of like foreground from background, or like earth versus sky, that type of segmentation that we can do in computer vision. I think there's another research direction in this, which is sort of semantic segmentation on maps. We have different ways of mapping. Some of it is crowdsourced. There are people out there annotating maps for OSM. You can also draw maps using satellite imagery, using the same sort of semantic segmentation. I think Microsoft has done that. But we could also be using the mobile phone signals and this understanding of like stops and motion, vehicular motion versus pedestrian motion, to be able to draw maps without maps, using the ping trails of humans, just aggregating over time to remove the noise. Even the speed of which the people are moving could provide segmentation of like roads into fast moving roads versus slow moving roads, and also uncover anomalies between the usage of roads versus how the roads have been drawn by these other sources. So the possibility of enrichment there too, I think.
This is kind of fascinating. So we've been talking for a while now and coming up with all these ideas of stuff you can do. And right at the start of the conversation, you said our data looks like this. It's like imagine a spreadsheet with a latitude, a longitude, a time, and an ID.
Right.
It's kind of amazing that from that we can see so much potential.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's the power of data science and data engineering. And I think geospatial data, you asked me why I chose this career, but like I think it's some of the most challenging out there in the domain of data science, because so little of what we do makes sense unless you can really just look at it on a map. Foursquare has Foursquare Studio, which is our visualization studio, and I think anytime we have any incoming data scientists, I always insist that they draw their maps in they don't just look at the data in tables and in statistics and metrics, but they actually plot their maps in studio, because you just don't really appreciate you don't have the correct contextual awareness until you plot things on a map. And that's part of the nuance of geospatial, and I think that's always been part of what fascinates me about it.
Yeah, so with that, I had a question I was going to ask you about, like, what are you going to do next, or are you run out of things to do? But you kind of, I think you've alluded to it that you haven't run out of things to do. That there's a lot to do there. It's very challenging. So I think I'll take this in a different direction for the last question. So the last question is:
Mm.
do you think that spatial is special, or is it just more data?
Well, I think it's related to what I've just been saying. Like trying to extract value from spatial data is definitely very challenging. I think in terms of the industry, it's still somewhat untapped. Things like targeting and attribution are very much low hanging fruit, and I think we owe it to ourselves to kind of unlock a lot of the other potential out there. And luckily, the other potential comes down to doing these more sophisticated things like understanding these user journeys throughout the urban landscape, building maps without maps, and figuring out. We do work for businesses. This is not just a research project. It's all about like how can we generate revenue from that as well? Is this something people are interested in, or is it just a paper that I'm going to present at a conference?
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you mentioned that right at the start. Data science, when you're talking about being a good data scientist, is can you see the bigger picture? Can you see how this is going to create value for our customers? And so that ties in nicely with what you just said there, at least in my mind. Gabriel, this has been awesome. I've really enjoyed talking with you. Covered a lot of ground, and really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, me too.
People know that you work for Foursquare. Is there anywhere in particular you'd like to point them towards if they want to go and learn more? I think you mentioned Foursquare Studio. That would be a great place for people to check out. Anywhere else we can share a link to or point people towards?
Yeah, we can link the website. The website is kind of a good springboard into all of the different, activities that are going on at Foursquare and the products we offer, as well as things like opportunity to explore Studio, which I would really invite everybody to try. It's an amazing kind of, like I say, geospatial data is nothing if you can't draw a map, and Studio is really drawing maps on steroids. So it actually makes it a very pleasurable experience. Like some of the maps I've created in studio, I want to just frame and put on the wall. Like it's almost art, to be honest.
Yeah, Studio is amazing. We've actually published an episode or two around Studio before, and I'll
Oh,
link
nice.
those up in the show notes. Again. Gabriel, thank you very much for your time. It's been awesome. Cheers.
Thanks, Danielle.
Thank you very much for listening all the way to the end. It's much appreciated. I really hope you enjoyed that episode with Gabriel Durkin, the Director of Data Science at Foursquare. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is the last in a series of podcast episodes I've produced together with Foursquare. They've been brilliant to work with. I hope that you enjoyed them. If you haven't checked them out yet, I'll put links to them in the show notes of this episode today. So that's it for me. That's it for this week's episode. I hope that you'll join me again next week. And as always, if you want to reach out to me for whatever reason, you can find me. You can find Mapscaping on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn, or check out our blog over at mapscaping.com. There'll also be contact details there. Okay, we'll talk again soon. Bye.